G'day, Starlo here with episode 8 of my regular Tuesday chats, brought to you as always by CM Partners Accounting. If you run or own a business and you're looking for a new accountancy firm, or you just want a second opinion on tax matters or whatever, have a talk to the good folks at CM Partners. If you use the Starlo link down below, they'll give you a totally free, no strings attached consultation to talk about your specific needs. They're great people, so have a chat to them. This Tuesday, I wanted to talk about some of my favourite fishing destinations over the past 60 years. Yeah, that's how long I've been fishing. During my lifetime, I've been fortunate enough to fish in every Australian state and territory, as well as about 14 or 15 other countries around the world. So as you can imagine, I've fished in some pretty good locations. What I want to do in this episode is narrow it down to my 5 absolute favourites, and that's actually made more difficult by the fact that I have fished in so many great places and I've got so many wonderful memories of trips that I've done. These include to exotic locations like beautiful Lord Howe Island off the far north coast of New South Wales, or Kiribati, Christmas Island, out in the middle of the Pacific, way to the south of Hawaii, with its wonderful flats fishing for bonefish. Absolutely fantastic. Or Shark Bay in WA. I've got some really fond memories of waking up early in the morning at Nanga Station on the back of Shark Bay, and the absolute sense of silence and isolation. You just hear the little waves breaking along the shell-grit beach and the distant bird calls. You really feel like you're on the edge of the world in places like that. And really exotic destinations like the wild Atlantic salmon rivers of the Kola Peninsula north of the Arctic Circle in Russia. Wow, what a trip that was. Or the otherworldly nature of the Mavora Lakes on the South Island of New Zealand, something straight out of Lord of the Rings. And in fact, they filmed a couple of sequences for that movie right there. There's a good chance that I'll never get back to any of those exotic locations, but you know, all I really need to do is close my eyes and imagine, and I'm transported back to those places and the wonderful experiences that I had there. And then there's my short list of the best fishing towns in Australia. And I've said this before, I reckon the 2 top towns in Australia from a fisherman's point of view are Weipa up on Cape York Peninsula and Exmouth over in WA. 2 absolutely fantastic towns with brilliant world-class fishing literally on their doorstep. But let's try and narrow it down to my top 5. I already know what's going to be at number 1, but I've got to tell you, the other 4 constantly change. And I reckon if I did this exercise again in a week or a month or a year, I'd probably come up with a different 4. But for right now, I'm going to try and nail it down. And here they are, starting with number 5. And it's got to be a Tasmanian destination because I absolutely love my trips to Tassie. Could have been Port Sorell, might have been Anson's Bay over on the northeast corner. But what I've decided to opt for is Montague, a little place that a lot of people have never heard of, right up on the northwestern corner of Tasmania. I've only been there a couple of times, but I was fortunate enough to stay for a week or so on both occasions. It's a wildly remote and beautiful part of the world. It's just around the corner from the aptly named Cape Grim, which is claimed to have the cleanest air on the planet. And I'm not surprised because most of it comes straight in from the Antarctic. The one drawback of that part of the world can be the weather. They get some pretty grim weather there. But Montague, on a good day in late summer or autumn, is just a magnificent place to be. Sparkling blue-green water, patches of reef and weed, sandy areas, some of the biggest King George whiting on the planet, prolific calamari, amazing lure casting for blue spot flathead. It's got a lot going for it. You can throw lures for salmon. On a good day, when the water's at its warmest, you might even find some yellowtail kingfish busting up in the current rips through the channel. So Montague is my number 5. If you ever get the chance to go there, grab it. All right, moving up to number 4, and I'm going to pick the Green Cape area down near the border of New South Wales and Victoria, particularly some of the camping spots within the National Park on Green Cape. Places like Saltwater Creek and Mawari Point and Batangaby Bay, Leatherjacket Bay. Some you can drive to, others you've got to walk to, and my daughter Amy and I did the actual light-to-light walk there from the lighthouse at Boydtown all the way down to Green Cape a few years ago, just before Christmas. We travelled as light as we could, just carried sleeping mats and rolled them out of an evening, fished off the rocks and the beaches. It is a wonderful part of the world. You can catch drummer and salmon and bream and all kinds of other critters off the shore there. It'll always hold a special place in my memory, but it's also somewhere that I try to get back to at least once a year. So that's number 4, Green Cape. Moving on to number 3, and it's got to be somewhere in the top end. And the thing that most of us associate with the top end are those gorgeous freshwater billabongs. Now I could pick a more remote one like the amazing 4 Mile Hole or some of the little lagoons and billabongs right out into Kakadu, but I'm actually going to go for the best known one of all, Corroboree Billabong. Look, it cops a flogging these days from the fishing point of view, and it doesn't fish like it used to, but it's still a terrific place to be, especially at the first glimmer of dawn. If you can launch your boat while it's still dark and you run down the billabong late in the dry season or during the build-up, it's lovely and cool early in the morning. There's often fog and mist rising off the surface of the water, bird life everywhere, lots of crocodiles. You might even see a couple of water buffalo out on the floodplains, and you can flick your lures or your flies up along the edges of all those lily pads in search of the prehistoric Saratoga and, of course, the barramundi that draw so many people out to Corroboree. If you've never been to Corroboree Billabong, and particularly if you've never been on there at dawn, do yourself a favour and get up there. It's one of those quintessentially Australian places that every single one of us needs to tick off the bucket list. When I lived in Darwin, Joe and I used to go out there on a regular basis, and then I went a couple of years without visiting, but I went back last year and it's still as wonderful as it ever was. Lots of boats out there now, and the fish have seen a lot of lures and flies. Like I said, it doesn't fish like it used to, but if you put the time and effort in, you'll still catch fish, you'll have a great time, and you'll see a unique part of Australia. So that was number 3, Corroboree Billabong in the top end. Number 2 is actually the southern side of Jervis Bay. Now, it's the northern headland of Jervis Bay in New South Wales that's really famous in fishing circles. It's the one with all those amazing platforms where people spin and live bait for big pelagic fish, including heavyweight tuna and even marlin and the occasional sailfish, would you believe? It's world famous, but it's actually the south side of Jervis Bay, down around Steamers Beach and the rocky headlands to the east and west of Steamers that hold the fondest memories for me. I spent a lot of time during the 1970s, 80s and even into the early 90s hiking into some of those rock fishing spots. Brooks's, the Pimple, Korangamites at George's Head, Moe's, the Old Light, they're all terrific ledges that offer a mix of spinning and live baiting for pelagics as well as bait fishing for all the usual suspects. But also just a wonderful place to be, again, early in the morning, and so many of my fishing location memories are tied to those early mornings. The sun coming up out of the ocean and those big cliffs behind you and the pockets of shadow at the base of them, and that ocean just breathing in and out, up and down the ledges, and the foamy patches, and casting a lure or a fly out into them and being crunched by big Australian salmon or bonito or yellowtail kingfish, mackerel, tuna, all kinds of fantastic targets. I don't even know what the access is like to a lot of those spots anymore, or whether you're even allowed to go into them, but boy, they hold a special place in my memory. I hope that at least some of them are still accessible. At the very least, you need to take the hike down to Steamers Beach itself. It wins my vote as probably the most beautiful beach in Australia, and quite unique for an East Coast beach in that it faces almost due south, and all sorts of stuff tends to wash in there. If you're into beach combing, it's a great place to go. Also, not a bad beach for chucking out a bait for a whiting or a bream or a salmon or a tailor. So that was number 2, the southern side of Jervis Bay. And that brings us, of course, to number 1. And as I said, I knew from the outset what my pick of my favourite fishing destination in Australia and, in fact, in the world would be. And it's the western side of the northern tip of Cape York Peninsula, specifically the area from about the mouth of the Jardine River down to the mouth of the Skardon River, or even from Virilia Point down to the Skardon. The wonderful rivers in there, the Doughboy, the Cotterell, the MacDonald, the Jackson, one of my absolute favourites. And I was lucky enough to first visit that stretch of coast with my good mate Captain Greg Bethune, who operated liveaboard charter vessels in that area for at least a decade and a half. When I first fished with Greg, he was running a relatively small boat called the Capricorn Mist that would only take 6 paying passengers. A typical trip on the old Capricorn Mist was to head out of Seicher on the very tip of Cape York and make your way down the west coast all the way to the Skardon River. It was a pretty long run, and then we'd spend the week or sometimes 10 days fishing our way back to Seicher, fishing all of those rivers. Greg would take the Capricorn Mist into the mouth of the river, anchor up, and we'd jump into the skiffs that he'd been towing and fish those wonderful, wonderful areas at the mouths of those rivers and offshore. It's the flats out at the mouths of those rivers that most populate my memories, chasing things like golden trevally and giant herring and massive queenfish, and of course the most highly prized of all, the Indo-Pacific permit. I actually caught my first ever permit on fly over at Broome in WA, but it was only about that big. My first proper permit on fly was at the mouth of the Jackson River on one of those trips with Greg back in the 90s. Watching a whole pod of permit tailing and nosing on the flats and getting a crab fly in front of them and finally catching one. It was definitely a pinnacle in my fly fishing career. But there were so many other times of just walking on the beaches, as my mate Ian Miller used to say, walking on the beaches, looking at the creatures, to quote that song. And you just never knew what you were going to see next when you walked on those beaches. On a rising tide in particular, all kinds of critters would come in and swim right along the edges, feeding on the bait fish, feeding on the crabs and the prawns. Sometimes we caught barra off the beaches, other times it was queenfish or giant herring or golden trevally, and we'd see those permit, and eventually we learnt how to catch them. And then we'd go up into the rivers and chase mangrove jacks and barra on the snags and fingermark bream on the deeper snags. And when the weather was good, we'd head offshore, chase long-tailed tuna and mackerel tuna on fly, or Spanish mackerel. I caught my biggest ever Spanish mackerel on fly up there in a sparse burley trail, just swinging a big baitfish profile fly through the burley trail. So many great memories. And sure, it's another place that has definitely changed over the years. When I started going there in the early 90s, you'd do that whole week-long or 10-day trip and not see another boat, or you might see a commercial mackerel fisher or some of the locals running between their settlements. But it was actually quite noteworthy when you saw another boat. And yet 10 years later, it was common to see quite a lot of other vessels, four-wheel drives on the beaches, and it's nowhere near as remote and hard to get to these days as it once was. And that's a bit of a double-edged sword. It means a lot more people can enjoy it, but it's also lost a little bit of that edge of remoteness that it had going for it in the past. And I've got to admit, the fishing isn't as good as it used to be, but it's still very, very good by world standards. I must have done well in excess of 20 trips with Greg between the early 90s and the early 2000s. Sometimes I'd go 2 or 3 times a year. I just loved it so much. The opportunities that it offers and the diversity of fish that are available, the different styles of fishing that you can do, but particularly the fly fishing. It was 9-weight fly rod country. There was very little up there that you couldn't catch on a 9-weight fly rod. You could have gone a bit lighter on some of the species, and sometimes you needed to go a bit heavier, but a 9-weight sort of covered most of it. And so I spent a lot of days with nothing but a 9-weight fly rod with an intermediate fly line on a reel in my hand, walking those beaches, drifting the flats, fishing the snags and heading offshore. Great memories. And for that reason, that part of Cape York will always hold a special place in my heart. But you know what? When it comes to picking the very best fishing locations, your favourite spots, there's a lot to be said for the next one. The one you haven't fished yet, the one you're still dreaming about, that pool around the next corner in the river, that beach beyond the next headland, that rocky point at the end of the winding, rugged dirt road, the billabong that lies just on the other side of the next row of pandanus trees. As anglers, we're always yearning for that next spot. And sometimes it's right on our doorstep. We should never overlook those places that we fish on a regular basis. We're very, very lucky in this country. A lot of people from other countries would see those places and think, wow, that's paradise. And we tend to take them for granted. I hope you've got your own list of special locations, and I hope you're adding to it all the time. And maybe one day you'll find that magical honey hole that goes straight to the top and becomes your number one. Until next time, when we get together for our next Tuesday chat, which will again be brought to you by CM Partners Accounting, don't forget to get onto them and organise your free consultation using the link in the description down below. Until next time, this is Starlo wishing you happy fishing and tight lines.